So here we come to the third selection, or the third part of Plato's Meno, and I think it's simpler. It's simpler on the surface, at least. It's easier to follow, but on the other hand, it raises some very interesting questions that are sort of kind of in the background, or implied questions, or implied issues. Let's just recap. At this point, Socrates has gone to great lengths to try to convince Meno that they should inquire into this basic question, what is virtue, together. He has gone to great lengths. He has tried to answer all of Meno's objections, going so far as to try to demonstrate with this little boy the idea that all knowledge is recollection. And you'll remember that this is in response to Meno's paradox about inquiry. Sorry, I live in Center City. It can be noisy outside. This paradox about inquiry, that it's not possible to inquire into what you know. So if that were true, philosophy would be impossible, and Socrates certainly doesn't want that to be true. So he goes to great lengths to try to convince Meno to do philosophy. That is to which means, to a certain extent, to look into some very basic, difficult questions. And in the beginning of this selection, he's clearly given up. That is, Socrates has given up on trying to get Meno to ask the question, what is virtue? And he has agreed to look into the question of whether it's teachable or not. And he says the way that they should proceed is on hypothesis. That is, given a certain hypothesis, which is basically a certain guess or a certain assumption about what virtue is, then it will be teachable. And the hypothesis is that virtue is knowledge. That is, if there's the hypothesis, the hypothetical, if virtue is knowledge, then it would be teachable. And if it's not knowledge, it's not teachable. So Socrates is willing to compromise with Meno, that is, to abandon, seemingly, the question what virtue is for his original question of whether it's teachable or not, or whether it's something that we just have by nature. But he focuses on whether it's teachable or not. Well, if it's knowledge, then it would be teachable, because certainly knowledge is something that's teachable. And if it's not knowledge, then it wouldn't be teachable. Which I don't know how, that immediately leads to another question, though, and that is whether virtue is knowledge. As he says here, the next question, whether virtue is knowledge or of another species. And species just means kind, right? Sort. So if virtue is knowledge, then it'll be teachable. But then the question immediately is virtue knowledge? And he gives reasons to think that it is. That is, that good things only really are good things when they are used in the right way. And he's talking about things like intelligence and wealth and wit and physical strength. That these things are goods, but they're qualified goods. They're goods when they're used with knowledge. So virtue is a good thing. So it would seem that it is also knowledge. That is, things are only really good. So there is. I mean, I'm kind of really reducing that, but it's right here if you want to follow the conclusion that Socrates makes, a qualified conclusion. Remember, this is all sort of not the way that Socrates wants to go about it. The idea that virtue indeed is knowledge. And if it's knowledge, then it would seem that it could be taught. So there's a little bit of, argument here, reason to believe that that we have an answer to Meno's original question, that virtue is not something that comes to people by nature and you either have it or you don't, that it is something that can be acquired through teaching, because if it's knowledge, then it can be taught. And if it can be taught, then it's something that you can acquire. So Socrates actually deals with, now whether he believes all this is really good. Well, I'm doing this under duress, he says. I don't really know what virtue is, so I can't really be sure of these things, but we can argue about it or we can look into it on given certain assumptions. He seems to have responded in some way to Meno's original question. And the answer is that virtue is indeed teachable. But the first sign that maybe Socrates is not completely satisfied with this is what he says at the bottom of page 3. Because after coming up with this sort of quickie argument that virtue is knowledge and therefore virtue is teachable, he raises a question sort of kind of out of the blue. He says, I will try and tell you why, Meno. I do not retract the assertion that if virtue is knowledge, it may be taught, but I fear that I have some reason in doubting whether virtue is knowledge. For consider now and say whether virtue, and not only virtue, but anything that is taught, must have teachers and disciples. Surely. And conversely, may not the art of which neither teachers nor disciples exist be assumed to be incapable of being taught? True, but do you think that there are no teachers of virtue? This is Meno asking Socrates. Socrates says, I have certainly often inquired whether there were any, and taken great pains to find them, and have never succeeded. That is, Socrates says, I've never found any real teachers of virtue. And he said, well, if virtue is knowledge, then it would be teachable. But if something is teachable, you would think that there were teachers of it and students of it. But Socrates says, I haven't found any. So this is meant to raise, to throw doubt on the idea that that virtue is indeed knowledge, because if it's knowledge, then it would be teachable. But if it's teachable, then there would seem that there should be teachers of it. But if there are no teachers of it, then is it really teachable?